Congressman Issa, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
No, absolutely. This is an extremely important issue and one that you've been covering since the start.
It is important, and more significant is the fact that today you and the House Speaker John Boehner sent a letter to Attorney General Eric Holder demanding answers. This is from the House leadership. What kind of weight does this carry in the mind of the Department of Justice?
This letter is extremely significant because the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the House, the Majority Whip, all back up the position of our committee that, in fact, we deserve answers. We, the American people, Brian Terry's family deserves answers. The people in Mexico have lost their loved ones on two important issues. Who at Main Justice is responsible for Fast and Furious? And where is the list of people who caused Congress and the American people to be lied to on February 4th of last year and not have it corrected for 10 months? We need to know who was part of the lie and who's part of the cover-up. Those are essential. They're essential for the separation of and the equal rights and obligations of our two branches, and that's what the Speaker very clearly laid out in the letter.
Mm-hmm. And I thought it was interesting, too, among the many things that you highlight in that letter, you bring up the issue that the Deputy Attorney General wrote in his letter, Cole wrote, about concerns that further congressional action might cause damage between the legislative and the executive branch. We're talking about damage they caused, aren't we?
We're absolutely talking about damage they've caused. And if their answer is we can't have good terms unless we turn a blind eye to Brian Terry's murder, turn a blind eye to Congress being lied to, well, then we're not going to have good terms. To have good terms between the two branches requires a level of respect. And the Speaker of the House made it very clear that one of those elements of respect is accountability for this, what the Attorney General called a fatally flawed operation, and, of course, accountability for those who made false statements to Congress and covered it up.
But this, as you pointed out, this is an administration that doesn't respect the checks and balances put in place by our founding fathers. What difference is this letter going to make in the eyes of this administration?
The weight of the Speaker of the House is the weight of the majority of the House. If the Speaker of the House feels that he has been that the Attorney General has been unresponsive to the Speaker, then in fact contempt would be an inevitability. All of us as Republicans and a great many Democrats support the Speaker's need to get these answers, and I believe that's what's going to carry the day. As you know, there are 31 Democrats in the House who took the extraordinary measure of writing the President and urging the Attorney General to fully cooperate. It's very clear the Attorney General hasn't. This really is his last chance to cooperate in these two important areas. And I want to highlight the second one, even though the most important one by definition is accountability for those who led to Brian Terry's murder. The second one has an interesting and important point, which is the worst thing you can have to relationships between our two branches, or three branches, including obviously the judiciary, is false information. We cannot operate in a cover-up and lie environment. We have to have truthful disclosure. Remember, under oath, people have said no guns were walked. And in fact, we now have new information and under oath testimony that, of course, guns were walked.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the wiretaps. You highlight the fact that, if they signed off on these wiretaps, they had to know about what was going on.
Well, that's something that many of the counsels, including former U.S. attorneys that serve on my committee, they know very, very well the level of detail necessary for many of these parts of investigation. And of course, we don't want public disclosure of wiretaps. We don't want that information. What we want, though, is the truth that flows from who signed, who knew, who helped develop. And the Attorney General knows he can deliver this. He knows it will in no way, shape, or form adversely affect any law enforcement activity other than those activities like Fast and Furious that, in fact, are wrong and need to be stopped.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting, too, because in Cole's letter, he talks about, hey, there's all these claims of a cover-up. This is not a cover-up. And he points out that the lack of documents showing high-level discussions about the tactics used in Fast and Furious makes clear that these tactics began in Arizona. What do you say to that?
Where tactics begin and where they are ultimately approved and funded, in fact, is the difference between a renegade operation, which they initially claimed, and the truth, which we now know, which is, in fact, that this was authorized and paid for by funds that came out of Washington Justice. And again, the lack of documents is a lack of production of documents. I would have to use an analogy that maybe is a little old, but the Menendez kids killed their mother and father. To claim they're now orphans wouldn't be right, would it? And to not deliver documents and then say, you see, there are no documents proving is in fact not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but inherently disingenuous. And the Speaker of the House called them on this, and called them in a very straightforward way on it.
And if these documents aren't there, then why the heck won't they turn over the rest of them so you can see for yourself?
Exactly. In the Nixon situation a generation ago, Nixon tried not to turn over documents and said they weren't responsive, and tapes, and they weren't responsive. And, of course, ultimately, they were discovered and they were responsive. In this case, the Speaker has wisely narrowed to the most essential items that the American people not only are entitled to but have to get. Who's responsible for Brian Terry's murder, besides triggermen, but up the chain in justice? And, of course, most importantly, when you lie to Congress, there has to be accountability to those who orchestrated it. And when you cover up, there has to be accountability. And the Speaker's made that very clear, and in a way that I believe will be very, very well received by the House if we're forced to take further measures.
Congressman, we also talked with Congressman Gozer and Congressman Farenthold earlier this week, and they both said the waiting game is over, that we need to move forward with contempt charges right now. Is this letter from the House Speaker an indication that the waiting game is over?
When the Speaker of the House says a few weeks, he means it, a few weeks. The waiting game is over. We cannot and continue to hope for some sort of a change by justice to come without action. This action that the Speaker took is extraordinary. When the Speaker of the House speaks to the President directly on a subject like Operation Fast and Furious and the failure of the Attorney General, and then writes a direct letter from all of House leadership to the Attorney General, it speaks volumes of just how important this is. This should never have been important enough for the President to know about it. It should never have been important enough for the Speaker of the House to be concerned with it. It should have been handled a year ago. But because it wasn't, because false statements were made and cover-ups have occurred, it now becomes, like so many Washington stories, it's not about the crime, it's about the cover-up.
Absolutely. And I also thought it was interesting how the Speaker in the letter pointed out that he said, we are troubled by the department's assertions that the executive branch possesses the ability to determine whether inquiries from the legislative branch have been fully complied with.
Well, this is an important one. The Speaker of the House, number 3 in line for the presidency, and the constitutionally responsible officer for one half of all of our branch, is making a very clear statement, very well supported by the Constitution and Supreme Court decisions, and that is that each branch satisfies itself as to its responsibility. The federal court, the U.S. Supreme Court, does not take the President of the United States' suggestions of what the Constitution is. They decide it themselves. And, of course, that's notwithstanding what the President would seem to say on occasions. And the same is true of our branch, and quite frankly, the same is true of their branch. And you can imagine if Eric Holder went out with his Justice Department to seek discovery on some company or some individual, can you imagine if that company or individual said, well, we've given you everything that we think is responsive to what you need? Eric Holder wouldn't quit at that point, and neither can we.
And, again, this is a president who's made clear the Constitution, he says, gets in his way from doing what he wants to do. He doesn't respect the Constitution the way we do.
Well, I think that's an important point, that he obviously, this man does not, this president and the Attorney General do not seem to like the First and Second Amendment. Yeah. They're not keen on the Fourth. I'm not sure how they like the Fifth. The 10th, obviously, they're very much not happy with the inherent powers of the states. But having said that, it's in the Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, not the amendments, the basic first 3 major paragraphs of the Constitution, that it's laid out just how clearly what our powers and responsibilities are. And the Speaker of the House, speaking on behalf of the vast majority of Congress, obviously, has spoken loudly of what the standing is, and he's supported by Supreme Court decisions. And I think that the Attorney General is going to have to now take significant notice of this, respond in a way he has not responded, or the inevitable will be a battle that, in fact, we do not welcome. We are not looking for. We're looking for the cooperation that the Brian Terry and his family needs. And, of course, we're looking to represent our responsibilities to the American people. A week will go by between today's letter and our return from Memorial Day. That's ample time for the Attorney General to seek counsel and to do the right thing.
Well, and I think there were a lot in the media who were questioning where House Speaker Boehner came in on this and what you were doing as far as, saying we're going to have to move forward with contempt charges. Well, I think he's explained where he stands now on this.
He's explained it very, very well, and his responsibilities have included counseling myself. I've had multiple meetings with him and with the leader, and they've been very, very helpful. As you know, he headed a committee. He's done a lot of these things over his long career, and it's very helpful when you have somebody who's been in so many positions who says, what do you think about this, Darrell? What do you think about that? So he's been a friend, a mentor, and as you can see today, a strong supporter of what needs to happen on behalf of the American people related to Fast and Furious.
And I know as much as you've been fighting as hard as it's got to be reassuring to you to have this letter sent to Holder today.
It feels good for the leadership of the House to be united all on one letter to make it clear to people that we are resolute in ensuring that the American people get answers.